I am Layla Dawson, a 27-year-old waitress in a dusty Nevada diner with nothing but an eviction notice and a son who hasn't been fed dinner. I'm not desperate, just desperate. When a shady auction offers a sum no mother should ever have to part with, I step in with shaking hands and a numb heart. Lot 23, $1 million, sold. To Kareem Al-Fed, a billionaire power broker and a man who believes emotions are burdens. He doesn't want love. He wants an heir and a woman who will disappear afterward. But I will never disappear. What begins as a transaction soon unravels everything he thought he knew about control family and the price of silence. Because the woman he bought, I have a heart he can't afford to break. They took me to him right after the bid closed, like cargo, like I was something to be claimed, not someone who had just sold off a piece of her soul. I barely had time to register the room, the faces, the fact that I was breathing again. Everything felt suspended, unreal. Then he stepped in. Kareem Al-Fed. He didn't speak much, but his presence filled the space with a silence so dense it suffocated the air itself. There was no welcome, no introduction, just a thick contract he slid across a marble desk like it weighed nothing. On that paper was everything, terms, clauses, and the future of a child I hadn't even conceived yet. My name would be erased from the birth certificate, the child would be his, and I would be a phantom paid to disappear. You'll be compensated. Handsomely, he said, voice even devoid of emotion, as if money could balance out the gravity of walking away from something that would share my eyes, my blood. I signed. My hand shook, but I didn't stop. That's what survival is, sometimes choosing to bleed now so you don't starve later. The pen scratched across the paper, quiet but deafening. He nodded once. Transaction complete. The next morning, a black sedan waited outside my crumbling apartment. I watched Ames sleep his little chest, rising and falling in a rhythm I'd memorized like prayer. I kissed his forehead, whispered a lie about work, and stepped out before I could fall apart. The door clicked shut behind me like a final sentence. The mansion loomed large, cold, and unwelcoming. The marble floors echoed beneath my shoes. The ceilings were too high, the air too still. It smelled like power, sterile, untouchable. I didn't belong there, not in the designer dresses they laid out for me, not in the makeup that hid the tired mother beneath. Kareem didn't touch me. He didn't need to. His control wasn't physical. It was structured, scheduled, suffocating. Every move I made had already been decided. Medical checkups were clockwork. Vitamins arranged by color and time. They monitored my diet, my weight, even the way I slept. It wasn't intimacy. It was inventory. Still, I caught him watching me sometimes, not with lust or curiosity, but calculation, like I was a variable he couldn't predict. He called me Miss Dawson. I called him Sir. That was our understanding. Distant, transactional, impossibly cold. But when night fell and the desert air crept in through the balcony doors, something in me cracked. I'd stand there clutching the railing, staring into that vast stretch of nothing, and think of peanut butter sandwiches on linoleum floors. Of Am's giggle when I tickled his belly, of the way he said "mama" like it was the only word that ever mattered. I had traded those memories for silence and silk sheets. Some nights the grief choked me. I cried into pillows, biting back sound as if the walls could snitch. Then there was Amira, the housekeeper. She never asked questions, just brought me tea and told me which windows let in the best moonlight. She showed me where the floorboards squeaked and where the cameras didn't see. Her kindness was quiet, but it made something in me thaw. She never looked at me like I was bought. She looked at me like I was surviving. A week passed. One afternoon, Kareem summoned me not to the office or clinic, but to the garden. He was trimming Rose's sleeves, rolled his hands covered in soil. It was the first time I saw him doing something human. I don't want this to be harder than it has to be. He said, eyes on the thorns. I stared at him, stunned by the attempt at softness. Then maybe don't buy women, I said, voice low but firm. He stopped. Just for a second, the shears hung midair, and in that silence I saw it. Pain, old buried deep, armored in steel, but pain all the same. He didn't argue, just gave a single nod, like he had expected me to say it, and maybe even respected me for doing so. That night dessert arrived in my room. Not just any dessert, chocolate tart. The exact kind I used to sneak from the diner on late shifts when no one was looking. Coincidence, maybe. But I had stopped believing in those. I stared at it for a long time before I took a bite. It tasted like memory, like loss, like something shifting in the dark. And I realized that in this gilded cage, something had cracked not just in me, but in him. And maybe that crack would be enough to let the truth in, or burn everything down. I started noticing things tiny, almost invisible at first, but impossible to ignore once seen. Like how Kareem never had to raise his voice to command a room. Silence followed him naturally, like gravity. Or how he spent hours in the garden focused solely on that one rose bush, pruning it with the kind of care you'd expect from a surgeon. It wasn't about the plant, it was about control. It was always about control. That I understood. He didn't smile, he didn't pry, but he listened. And that somehow was more unsettling than if he had interrogated me. Listening meant he was gathering, measuring understanding. You never knew what he planned to do with what he learned. Then one night, I passed the music room and paused. Something stopped me, something soft, unfamiliar. Piano. The notes drifted into the hallway like memories, fragile and aching. I pushed the door slightly ajar and saw him there alone, his fingers gliding across the keys like they belonged there. The man I'd only seen composed and calculating was suddenly human, still and small and heartbreakingly distant from the man who had signed my name off a birth certificate. My mother taught me, he said, still facing the keys. I should have left, but I didn't. I whispered, "It's beautiful." He turned slowly and looked at me, not through me. And in that brief moment, I didn't see the billionaire who'd bought my silence. I saw a boy once loved deeply and abandoned just as completely. After that, something changed, slowly. He began to join me for breakfast. Just a few minutes, just a few words, nothing intimate, nothing invasive. But it was something. He asked what books I liked. I answered guarded, he remembered. And days later, I found those very books stacked beside my bed. No note, no comment. Just placed there, like a quiet offering. It wasn't affection, but it was attention, and that was dangerous, because I kept reminding myself this wasn't a love story. This was a deal, a transaction dressed in marble and formality, and I was still hiding the truth. I told myself it was to protect Ayam, that if Kareem ever found out, it could unravel everything. I couldn't risk that, not when my son's safety lived in the shadow of a contract. But lies are like pebbles in your shoes. You feel them with every step, and eventually they wound you. The breaking point came without warning. I walked into the living room and froze. There it was, Am's photo sitting on the coffee table, and in Kareem's hands. He wasn't gripping it like a weapon. He held it carefully, reverently. His expression unreadable. "Who is this boy?" he asked. My mouth dried. The lie burned on my tongue but wouldn't come out. "My son," I said. "His name is Aim." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. It was deliberate, final. "You lied to me," he said, calm but sharp like glass. "You were paid, protected, given everything. And you still hid this." I wanted to scream that I hadn't been given anything, only replaced. That I was never protected, only silenced. But I didn't. I stood there shaking, exposed, waiting for the storm. But instead of rage, I saw something else in his eyes: betrayal. Yes, but also something more elusive. A kind of quiet pain, a recognition. Later that night, he summoned me to the library. I entered expecting dismissal. Instead, he slid a paper toward me. I reviewed the contract, he said. There's nothing in it that forbids you from being his mother, but there's also nothing that protects your right to see him. I held my breath. My heart pounded. You'll be allowed visits, he continued. But there's one condition: he doesn't know the truth. Not yet. My voice barely escaped me. Why he met my eyes. For once there was no shield in his gaze, because I grew up without answers. I know what that does to a child. That's when I saw it again, the boy beneath the billionaire. The child raised by legacy, not love. The son of a ghost mother, and a man who mistook control for care. And in that moment, I didn't feel powerless. I felt understood. I felt seen. The days moved like ghosts slipping past without sound or substance, yet leaving their weight behind. Each morning I woke in that palace of stillness, buried beneath sheets, soft as breath, and a ceiling that gleamed like polished bone. Sunlight filtered through gold-trimmed curtains, catching on the glass and silk of a life that should have felt opulent. Instead, it felt like exile, a quiet, gleaming prison, built not of bars, but of absence. They kept me on a schedule. Vitamins in the morning, medical checks every third day, whispered updates from the doctor who smiled like his face had been trained to forget. My body was no longer mine. It belonged to the plan, to the contract, to Kareem. My womb wasn't sacred. It was logistical, a vessel, a future with a timeline and a price tag. I didn't speak unless I had to. Words felt dangerous, like they might splinter the carefully preserved silence around me. The staff nodded, bowed, moved through the halls with professional grace, but their eyes never lingered. Even the walls seemed to breathe like they were listening. Except for Amira. She moved differently, her presence a quiet act of rebellion. She didn't pity me. And because of that, I trusted her. She brought my food warm, not reheated. She folded my laundry with a kind of gentleness I hadn't realized I missed. One night she left a notebook in my drawer. No explanation, just the gift. You'll need somewhere to put your thoughts, she murmured when I found her the next morning. That night I wrote. I wrote about AM, about peanut butter dinners, and the way he slept with one hand curled in my hair. I wrote about the lie I told to walk away from him. About Kareem, who bought a future without ever asking about my past. I didn't see him for 3 days. His absence was louder than his presence. Then one morning, he appeared in the garden like a ghost slipping into focus. He was tending to that same rose bush again, sleeves rolled, shirt collar open, like the tension didn't live in his bones. I froze when he looked up. "Walk with me," he said. I hesitated. I should have said no, but I followed. The path wound between marble statues and beds of lavender that perfumed the air with memory. His silence wasn't awkward. It pressed into the space between us with precision, like everything unsaid was measured by weight. "I assume you're being treated well," he said at last. I nodded. Better than I treated myself. He stopped then, turned to face me, and for the first time didn't look through me, he looked at me. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked. I wasn't ready for the question, or for the pain it triggered, because sometimes hunger speaks louder than dignity. I said, my voice low but steady. He didn't reply immediately. He only watched me, not with judgment, but with the kind of quiet curiosity you reserve for storms, wondering not just where they'll land, but where they began. Then, without another word, he walked away. That night, a tray arrived in my room. On it sat a dark chocolate tart, the exact kind I used to sneak from the diner when I could afford a treat. No one here knew that. No one should have known that. The next morning, a book appeared on my nightstand, an old favorite I'd once mentioned in passing. Again, no note. Just placed there like a whispered acknowledgement. I began to watch him too. Kareem never rushed. He didn't need to. His authority was gravity, inevitable, invisible, inescapable. He walked with the silence of someone who had built a kingdom from ash and would reduce it to dust again before letting it be touched by chaos. But beneath that command, I started noticing the cracks. Some nights when the house had gone still, I'd pass the music room and hear the piano. Not scales or showpieces, just fragments of melody, soft and aching, slipping through the door like breath. I never entered, but I listened, always. Until one evening I paused at the door a little too long. The hinges creaked. He looked up. Our eyes met. His fingers froze above the keys. "You play?" I said, surprised. He nodded slightly. "My mother taught me." I stepped in without thinking, sat in the shadows just close enough to see the curve of his shoulders. "It sounds like missing someone." He didn't answer, just lowered his gaze and pressed the next note. And for the first time, the air between us didn't feel like a contract. It felt like a beginning. Time didn't move in the mansion. It floated suspended in the air like dust motes that caught the light but never landed. Every day bled into the next, a rinse and repeat cycle of quiet rituals and untouched opulence. The breakfast tray arrived at the same time each morning, silver covers, still gleaming contents, still warm, yet always barely touched. The marble floors echoed back only the soft thud of my steps, as if the house itself had learned to muffle anything too human. Even silence had a rhythm here, curated and precise. I tried to create structure in the shapeless hours. Morning walks through the garden, afternoon journaling, evening counting of the birds that landed, then fled from the balcony railing. I documented the arrival of roses in bloom. I memorized the creak in the third stair. I timed how long the sunlight lingered on the west-facing wall. It gave the illusion of purpose. But the truth gnawed at me. Everything here felt arranged as if nothing was meant to be touched. Even the beauty which should have comforted felt like an exhibit behind glass. What I missed most wasn't freedom. It was noise. Real, chaotic, messy noise. I missed the shriek of cartoons left running in the background, the rhythmic thump of Ames' feet across cheap linoleum, the spill of juice and laughter, the unexpected joy in the mundane. I missed his voice, the way he'd call for me from another room or mispronounce a new word with all the confidence in the world. Each night I stared at my phone thumb hovering over the call button like a weight, but I never pressed it. I couldn't risk hearing his voice only to lie to it. I couldn't tell him when I'd be back. I didn't even know if I would be. One afternoon, I sat in the library, half lost in thought, my fingers tracing the worn spine of a children's book, the same title I used to read to Aam every night before bed. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone, not even Amira. It had been a secret held close like a talisman. When Kareem entered the room without knocking, I flinched. He paused mid-step when he saw the book in my hands. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "I asked them to bring in titles from your hometown. I thought you might feel less displaced." Displaced. The word landed heavier than it should have. I should have hated it. But I didn't. Because for once he didn't say owned or bought or kept. He saw me not as property, but as someone unmoored. Someone adrift. A few days later, I found a note slipped under my door, simple and clean in his tight handwriting. "There's a piano recital tonight. You might like it. K, no demand, no pressure." An invitation. So I went. The recital was small, candlelit, and intimate, the music delicate enough to break the walls we both pretended not to hide behind. He sat 2 rows ahead, posture, straight face, unreadable. But when the final note faded into silence, he turned. Not fully just enough to catch my eyes. That glance wasn't calculated. It wasn't contractual. It was human, and it lingered longer than it should have. Later that evening, I returned to my room and found a fresh bouquet of lavender on my nightstand. No card, no explanation, just its scent, subtle, comforting, intentional. Like someone had been listening, like someone remembered. Kareem still spoke in clipped, precise tones, always measured, always distant, but I began to sense something else underneath. Something rawer, unfinished. Loneliness, maybe? Or guilt twisted into discipline. Whatever it was, I knew it well. It mirrored the ache I tried to bury every night. One evening, I walked past the garden and saw him again. Same rose bush. Same careful trimming under the moonlight. The scissors glinted like silver secrets in his hands. "You always cut the thorns," I said, my voice just loud enough to be heard. "They ruin the shape," he replied, not looking up. "But they protect the bloom." He stilled shears midair. Finally, he looked at me. Some things need protecting, others need taming. I didn't argue. I just watched him, this man who sculpted beauty with blades and silence, who trimmed back danger in the name of control. Maybe I had judged him too quickly, maybe not entirely, but enough to wonder. Because behind these stone walls and beneath the weight of what brought me here, something had shifted. Not in the rules, not in the contract, but in the quiet that lived between us. It began not with words, but with silence and understanding that needed no explanation. One afternoon in the garden, he handed me the pruning shears without speaking. His fingers brushed mine, brief and unintentional, and I took them. I moved to the rose bush beside his, mimicking his precision, careful and deliberate. He watched me not with criticism or correction, but with a quiet curiosity. It wasn't about roses. It was about trust offered in the form of steel blades and unspoken permission. The next day when I returned to the bench by the lavender path, a book was waiting. Historical fiction, the kind I had once mentioned liking almost carelessly, in a conversation I hadn't realized he was listening to. No note, no gesture, just the book. He sat down beside me, another title in hand. We read in silence, letting the sun warm our shoulders. No need for conversation. Our nearness was enough. Days folded into each other like pages in a well-worn novel, and small moments grew roots. One evening at dinner, after hours of shared quiet, he surprised me with a question. Why books? His voice was low, almost tentative. I paused mid-bite. Because they don't leave, or lie, or forget you exist. He didn't blink. He didn't retreat. He simply nodded as if those were truths he knew too well. I used to think that too, he said. No elaboration, just those words, and the silence that followed carried more weight than explanation ever could. That night I found him in the music room again. He didn't notice me at first. His fingers drifted across the keys, coaxing out a melody that sounded like longing, like a memory, struggling to breathe. I stood at the doorway, watching, drawn in despite myself. "Your mother taught you right?" I asked softly. He didn't stop playing. "She died when I was 10. I stepped closer, drawn by something neither of us named. "She loved the garden," he said, eyes fixed on the piano. "Said growing things teach you patience." That music helped her remember who she was before she became a wife. His fingers faltered just slightly on the last note. The moment held its breath. "My father didn't play," he added. "He worked, built this empire, and I kept it from falling apart." I looked at him, not the mogul, not the mystery, but the man. The child left behind by loss, carrying a weight no boy should. I saw him, and maybe for the first time he allowed it. "You ever miss her?" I asked gently. "Every time I look at something beautiful," he said, "and feel nothing." The ache in his voice settled into my bones. I didn't know what to say. There was no comfort for that kind of emptiness. only recognition. Later that night, he knocked on my door, tea in hand, no assistant, no pretense, just him. I couldn't sleep, he admitted. Me neither. We took our mugs to the balcony. The night was cool, wrapped in a hush that felt more sacred than lonely. Steam curled between us like a fragile bridge. Above us, the stars hung heavy too close, as if daring us to say what we never had. "Why do you think people fear being alone?" he asked. I answered without thinking. Because it echoes, louder than noise, louder than pain. He tilted his head back, eyes scanning the sky. I used to think control would silence the echo. And now I asked. He turned, looked at me in a way that felt like peeling back armor. Now I wonder if I was just afraid of hearing myself. The words didn't need follow-up. They simply landed soft and sharp and stayed. We didn't touch. We didn't speak again that night. But something between us shifted. Not seismic, not sudden. Just a thread-thin, real humming with the weight of everything unsaid. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it wasn't distance anymore. It happened on a Tuesday. One of those forgettable, almost silent days when the world moves without incident until it doesn't. I had just come in from the garden, the smell of roses still clinging to my skin, when I saw Kareem standing in the middle of the living room, still as stone, holding something in his hand. A photograph. My photograph. Of Am. The blood drained from my face before my mind could even register what was happening. I had hidden that photo like a secret prayer folded in soft clothes, buried beneath layers of guilt and hope in the deepest corner of my drawer. I had taken every care to keep it safe, but somehow it had slipped through the cracks, and now Kareem held it like a verdict. He looked up slowly, his jaw clenched so tight I could almost hear it grind. "Who is this boy?" he asked, voice razor sharp but eerily calm. My lips parted, but no lie could fit into the shape of that question. No excuse would hold. The truth pressed up against my ribs, desperate to be free. "My son," I said quietly, the words brittle as glass. The silence that followed wasn't quiet, it thundered. It flooded the room, thick and suffocating like smoke from a fire we hadn't seen coming. Kareem didn't move. He just repeated the words, tasting them like they were poison. "Your son?" He said again, slower this time, each syllable loaded with disbelief, with accusation, with the sting of betrayal. "You didn't think this was important." His voice, still low, hit like a slap. Not loud worse, measured, controlled. The kind of anger that simmers instead of boils, but scorches just the same. I was afraid I said my voice already breaking. Of what? Of being sent away. Of losing the only chance I had to save him. He stared at me, his gaze sharp and glinting, like ice about to crack. "You let me believe you were alone. That this agreement, this contract was all you carried." I took a step forward, aching to explain, though I knew no explanation could smooth the betrayal. It was never about manipulation. I kept it from you because I was trying to protect him. I didn't know how much I could risk. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood there, wounded pride turning slowly into something more layered. "And what happens now?" he asked, voice colder. "You carry my child, while another waits for the mother who abandoned him." The words sliced through me like glass. I flinched, and I hated that I couldn't deny it. Not really. Even if I'd whispered to that I was going away for work, even if I kissed his forehead like I'd be home soon, the truth was I had left him. And no excuse, no intention erased that fact. I braced myself for the fallout, for the fury, for exile. But Kareem didn't shout. He didn't pace. He didn't even leave. He sat down on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, photograph still in hand. The silence stretched heavy and unforgiving. Then he asked more quietly, "This time, he doesn't know, does he?" I shook my head. I told him I had work, that I'd come back. Another pause. Long, thoughtful, and then, impossibly, "You can see him." My breath hitched. For a moment, I didn't believe I'd heard him correctly. But on my terms, Kareem said, the command in his voice returning like armor sliding back into place. "He cannot know about this arrangement. Not yet." Tears welled up before I could stop them. Tears not just of guilt, but of relief, of confusion, of something unnamed rising in my chest. "Why," I asked, voice barely audible. "Why are you allowing this?" He didn't look at me when he answered. "Because I know what it's like to grow up without answers." That night, I stood outside my bedroom door for a long time, the photo still clenched in my hand, its edges curling with the weight of the moment. I had lied. To Kareem, to to myself. But somehow that truth, once unleashed, didn't burn everything to ash. It settled into the cracks like sunlight after a storm, harsh, revealing, but warm. And as I closed my eyes, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe until now. Maybe the truth didn't have to destroy everything. Maybe it was the beginning of something real. He arranged everything with the kind of precision only he could manage, silent, seamless, absolute. The driver knew not to ask questions. The location was tucked away private, like something stolen back from the world. He carved out the time from his calendar with the same care one might give to a ceremony. No press, no staff, no eyes, just me hiding under a scarf like a ghost coming back to life, and a heart pounding so violently I could barely breathe. When the car stopped, I stepped out and saw him. Aim, my son, sitting on the porch of my old neighbor's house, knee-scraped, plastic truck in hand, laughter spilling from his mouth like sunlight. He didn't hesitate. The second his eyes landed on me, he dropped the toy and ran. "Mommy," I fell to my knees before I even realized I was moving. His body collided with mine, arms tight around my neck, legs wrapping around me like he was afraid I'd disappear again. I held him like I could stop time. He smelled like peanut butter and grass and joy. I buried my face in his curls, kissed the top of his head, and whispered, "I missed you so much." Behind us, silent but present, Kareem stood at a respectful distance. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence, once sharp and imposing, now felt like a boundary holding the moment safe. Am noticed him. Of course he did. "Who's that?" he asked, curiosity plain on his face. I turned, heart racing. "He's a friend," I said carefully. "He helped me come back to you. That was enough." Am walked straight up to Kareem, completely unfazed, eyes wide with the kind of innocence only children carry. "You got a car, like Batman?" Kareem's expression flickered something between surprise and amusement. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes, black, fast, cool." Ames said, nodding seriously. "Just like that, a bridge was built, no suspicion, no hesitation. Just trust, raw and unfiltered." We spent the afternoon in a park Kareem had reserved for us. It was quiet, shaded by old trees, with a playground that echoed with nothing but Am's laughter. I watched him from the bench, unable to stop the tears that crept into my eyes. Kareem sat beside me, distant yet near. He didn't interrupt. He didn't lecture. He simply existed beside the grief and gratitude warring inside me. "He's bright," Kareem said, at last watching Am as he chased a butterfly across the grass. "Curious." "He's everything," I replied. He nodded once. "You did well, with nothing." I turned to him. "You don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it for you," he answered. The ride back was silent, but not empty. It felt like something had settled between us, an understanding neither of us had the words for. That night when I returned to my room, a single-page document lay on my desk. It was a new contract. Shorter, clearer, human. It granted me full visitation rights, weekly phone calls, a private line that would always reach him. the clause about surrendering all contact after the birth gone. And at the bottom, already inked in bold black strokes, was Kareem's signature. I stared at it for a long time. I reread every line as if it might vanish the moment I blinked. And then, unable to contain the questions, I found him in the library. He was seated reading as though the world hadn't just shifted beneath my feet. "Why change it?" I asked, voice low. He looked up steady and unflinching. "Because this isn't just about heirs anymore." Something broke open inside me, not pain, not fear, something softer. Something I'd forgotten I was allowed to feel. S-Man, who had once viewed me as a transaction, was now offering something more than I ever expected. A choice, a voice, a future. No, we weren't a family yet, but we were no longer strangers bound by silence. We were beginning to feel. Kareem started showing up more often, but never loudly. It began with brief appearances like shadows passing through sunlight. He'd wander near when AM was in the garden, sometimes pausing by the fountain, sometimes leaning against a marble column, always with the same restrained presence. He didn't command attention, he invited it through curiosity. "What are you building?" he'd ask. Or, "Why is that truck in the fountain?" AM, in his honest, matter-of-fact way, always had an answer, often more story than explanation. And sometimes Kareem would laugh. Not the cold, polite chuckle I once heard in boardrooms and behind closed doors. A real laugh. Quick, surprised, uncontrolled. Then came the chessboard. One afternoon, Kareem set it out on the terrace table, the pieces arranged with meticulous care. He waited until AM wandered over, eyes wide with interest. "Want to learn?" he asked. I expected my son to run the other way he usually did when something looked like structure or rules. But that day he sat, eager, curious. "You move the horse like this," Kareem instructed gently, guiding the piece with deliberate calm. Frowned. "It's a knight." Kareem paused, then nodded. "So it is." I stood watching from the doorway, arms folded, heart full of something I didn't have a name for yet. Maybe awe, maybe fear, maybe both, and it didn't stop there. One evening, I found Ayam curled up in Kareem's reading chair, fast asleep, a space book open across his lap, his head tilted gently against Kareem's side. The man didn't flinch or shift to reclaim his space. He just looked at me as I stood frozen in the doorway and quietly said he wanted to hear about the planets. That was the moment it truly hit me. This wasn't temporary. Not for Am, not for Kareem, and not for me. The roles we had agreed to, the cold structure of a contract, the conditions, the timelines were slipping. I wasn't a womb anymore. I wasn't a transaction. I wasn't a hidden chapter in someone else's legacy. I was here, present, tangled in something real and growing and terrifying, because suddenly there was more than obligation. There was attachment. And with attachment came risk. One golden evening, as we sat watching the horizon melt into fire and lavender, Kareem turned to me with a quiet intensity. "He calls me Sir," he said, his voice soft but pointed. "He doesn't know what else to call you," I replied, surprised by my own breathlessness. He looked away briefly, fingers folding around the armrest like he was grounding himself. Then came the question, gentle, careful, like stepping onto thin ice. "What would you want him to call me?" I couldn't speak. The air around us held the weight of too many emotions. Gratitude, confusion, hope, fear. I didn't know what to say, what would be safe to say, so I said nothing. And maybe that silence was enough. Because just a few minutes later, Aam came running up the path, hair-wild cheeks flushed with joy. "Kareem, can you show me the stars again tonight?" "No, sir." No hesitation, just his name, soft and sure. Kareem didn't correct him. He simply stood, offered his hand, and said, "Let's go." And I stood there watching my son, whose world had once been so small and so fragile, walk side by side with the man who had once been a stranger, but now felt like something else entirely. Not a father, not yet, but not just a figure in the background either. And maybe that's when I realized the truth. Maybe none of this had ever been a performance. Maybe it had always been becoming something more. I caught him staring at me. Not with the cold precision I had once known, where every glance was a calculation, every silence a strategy, but with something unspoken and raw. This wasn't the gaze of a man managing a transaction. This was someone grappling with the weight of something he never expected to feel. We were standing on the rooftop, a place he rarely went. The air was thinner there, cleaner, as if the altitude peeled away the noise. Below us, Dubai pulsed with its usual glow, glass light motion, but up there the city felt far unreal. The stars above us burned steady, untouched. He stood beside me, arms crossed loosely, not out of defense, but habit. For once, he didn't lead with control. I never planned to be this person. He said, voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. I didn't reply. I couldn't. The truth of the moment sat like a knot in my throat. I was raised to believe feelings were distractions, he continued. That vulnerability made you weak. That control was the only form of safety. He paused, then turned toward me, his eyes searching mine. And now, I watch your son fall asleep beside me and wonder what I've missed my whole life. It wasn't a confession. It was a quiet surrender. The weight of those words hit me with a kind of force I hadn't braced for, not loud, but devastating. I wanted to let it in, to believe him, to reach across the space and say I saw him too. But fear has a long memory, and mine remembered what it felt like to be a body instead of a person, to be a line in a contract, not a name in someone's future. You changed this place, he said. You changed me. My heart stuttered. It should have been the moment I melted, the moment I let the story unfold the way hope always wants it to. But instead, I felt that old panic rise, that ancient survival instinct whispering, don't trust this. Don't get soft. Because I had been reduced before. Because once he had looked at me and seen what I could give him, not who I was. What if this transformation was temporary? What if I was just a chapter in his redemption arc, poetic, fleeting, and disposable? I need time. I said the words trembling but firm. I stepped back, not far, but enough to draw a line I wasn't ready to erase. He didn't flinch. His face didn't fall. But something shifted in his expressionless pain, more recognition. Like he'd expected this moment. Like maybe he understood. I'll give you that, he said quietly. And he did. He didn't push. He didn't disappear. He simply adjusted. A presence at the edge of every room. A second cup of tea on the table. A quiet nod when he passed me in the hall. He gave space not as punishment, but as respect. I spent the next few days circling myself, thoughts tightening like vines. Every memory, every question, every fear came back like echoes in a locked room. Amira found me pacing in the garden barefoot in the early light, the hem of my robe damp with dew. She didn't ask what was wrong. She never had to. But before she turned to leave, she said softly, "Not all men stay who they were. Some choose to become someone new." Her words followed me like a shadow. That night I sat beside Am's bed, stroking his hair as he slept, his breath steady and warm against the silence. And I thought about Kareem, the way he checked the locks now, without being asked, the way he always paused outside the door before entering, the way he'd started calling Am by his name instead of the boy. I was still afraid. But maybe that's what love is. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to stand beside it. Maybe love is not about certainty, but about choice. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to start choosing. And yet, for all the quiet mornings and careful glances, nothing could have prepared us for what came next. Not a gesture, not a word. Just pain. Sudden. Final. The moment our world cracked open, not with anger or fear, but with birth. The pain came in waves, each one more unforgiving than the last. It started as a whisper dull pressure curling low in my spine, then sharpened, slicing through my body with such intensity it stole the air from my lungs. I was halfway through a book, a distraction I'd been clinging to like a lifeline when the first real contraction hit. The book tumbled from my hands as my breath caught, and the world narrowed to a single burning line of pain. Amira was at my side in seconds, her practiced calm slipping for just a moment as her eyes widened. "It's time," she said, and everything after that blurred into urgency and motion. Footsteps, bags, instructions. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. Kareem appeared like a shadow made real, already rolling up his sleeves, jaw tight, eyes wild with something he hadn't let himself name. His voice was calm, but his hands, those hands always so precise and controlled, trembled as he reached for mine. "Car's waiting," he said, and I didn't let go of his hand for the rest of the ride. I gripped him as if pain could be transferred through skin, as if anchoring myself to him would keep me from floating away in agony. He didn't flinch once, not when I screamed, not when my nails dug deep into his flesh. He was there. Solid, steady, present. At the hospital, chaos met us at the door. Nurses moved quickly, wheeling me down sterile hallways. Someone tried to separate Kareem from me, insisting he wait outside. He didn't move. "I stay," he said, and the way he said it left no room for negotiation. And so he stayed. Hours blurred. Time lost meaning inside the fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell. I was caught in a current of contractions and breath and fire. My body, no longer mine, became a battleground. I cried out, swore, begged. And through it all, Kareem stayed. He wiped the sweat from my brow. He whispered things I couldn't remember, but his voice anchored me. Over and over, he said the same 3 words, quiet and unwavering: "You're not alone." Then suddenly a sound split the air, thin, sharp, primal, a cry, not mine, not his, our child's. The room stilled for a beat, and in that silence the weight of the world shifted. A nurse placed the tiny body in my arms. A boy. Small and pink and furious at the interruption to his world. I held him against my chest, and the sob that escaped me wasn't pain anymore. It was something deeper, older. My chest cracked open to make room for the flood of love, fierce and immediate. Kareem stood beside me, unmoving, his gaze locked on our son, like he couldn't look away. There was something in his eyes I had never seen before, reverence. He reached out slow, careful, like the child was made of glass and stars. "He's perfect," he said, and his voice broke on the word. I turned to him, barely able to speak. "Do you want to hold him?" He hesitated, just for a breath, then nodded. I placed our son in his arms, and in that moment, Kareem Al-Fed, the man who once bought control like it was oxygen, softened into something new. He didn't speak, didn't need to. I saw it in the way his fingers cradled the baby's head, in the way he looked at that fragile life as though it rewrote every chapter he'd lived before. This wasn't a transaction. This wasn't power. It was love, real, quiet, irrevocable. Later, after the bustle faded and the nurses left us in peace, we lay side by side on the hospital bed, our son sleeping between us, his tiny chest rising and falling with perfect rhythm. The room was dim, peaceful, almost sacred. Kareem turned to me, voice barely a breath. "Thank you." I looked at him, heart too full to answer. For what? For saving something in me I didn't know needed saving, and I no longer needed time, no longer needed distance or hesitation. I just needed this. Him. Us. and the fragile, fierce little life between us that had turned everything we were into something we never expected a family. 2 days after the birth, the hospital room was wrapped in a kind of stillness that didn't ask for attention. It simply existed. Our baby lay curled against my chest, his tiny body rising and falling with mine, a rhythm older than memory. Am sat close by his little legs swinging off the chair, humming softly as he flipped through a picture book with frayed corners and bent pages. The hum was familiar, soothing, the same one he used to sing when we had only each other and dreams we couldn't afford. The door opened quietly and Kareem stepped in. His suit jacket was gone, sleeves rolled to his elbows, tie missing. He looked nothing like the man who once commanded rooms with silence and presence. Instead, he looked undone, not messy, but real. A man who hadn't slept. A man who had been thinking. He moved toward the bed and sat on its edge, his posture careful, his eyes drawn to the sleeping baby like a compass locked on true north. In his hand, he held something tight, crumpled, but deliberate. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice lower than usual, touched by something raw. I didn't say anything. I simply waited. Then he opened his hand. The contract. It was folded into worn, familiar creases, the same one that once defined every rule of our agreement. He looked at it for a moment, then at me. This no longer defines us. And with that, he began to tear. Once, twice. Over and over until nothing was left but pieces on the floor. The sound of each rip felt like the snapping of invisible chains, each one freeing a part of me I hadn't realized was still bound. "I bought a promise," he continued, the words halting but true. "But I found something I never expected. A family." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small velvet box. My breath caught before he even opened it, but when he did, I saw it a ring. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't grand. It was simple, solid, and deeply human. Like him. Like us. "I don't want you to stay because of obligation or paperwork. I want you to stay because you believe what we've built is worth fighting for." My throat closed. My heart raced like it was remembering how to hope. Then from the corner of the room, looked up from his book, innocence shining through his wide eyes. "Mommy, is he asking you to marry him?" Kareem turned to him and smiled. Not the careful, rehearsed kind I once saw, but something unguarded. "Yes, I am." I laughed, though tears blurred the room. "Well, if I say yes, do I get to keep both of you?" My voice cracked as I said it because I already knew the answer. "You already have," Kareem whispered. I nodded, overwhelmed. "Yes, 1,000 times." "Yes." Am squealed, dropping his book and leaping into our arms, wrapping us both in a hug that was all legs, arms, and unfiltered joy. "We're going to be a real family." Our baby stirred against my chest, a tiny sigh escaping his lips, as if he too had been waiting for this moment to settle into place. Outside, the morning sun spilled through the hospital window in golden sheets, soft and warm. Light touched everything, our hands, our shoulders, Kareem's cheek, as he leaned in close. And for the first time since the auction, since the lies and the fear and the silence, I felt something I hadn't dared to believe in for a long, long time. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was finally, undeniably ours. The ceremony was set at dusk in a courtyard where palm trees stood like silent witnesses, their tall silhouettes dancing in the fading light. Lanterns dangled from silk-draped arches, glowing softly in the warm air like captured stars casting golden reflections on the marble tiles beneath our feet. The scent of jasmine drifted lazily through the air, familiar and calming, as if every petal carried a whisper of home. Every detail of this moment felt intentional, where east met west, not in contrast, but in harmony. Arabic calligraphy was etched into the aisle in delicate silver winding between woven fabrics, brought from my homeland, while oud music played quietly in the background, blending into the hum of joyful guests dressed in shades of sapphire saffron and soft rose. Their laughter was a mosaic of languages and cultures, a celebration of a love that had rewritten every rule. I stood behind a sheer curtain, breath held like a secret, my dress falling around me in layers of gold-threaded elegance and ivory silk. It was both armor and offering, crafted to reflect the woman I had become. Am peeked in his tiny suit, slightly crooked, his grin wide and uncontainable. "You look like a queen," he whispered, eyes filled with pride. I bent down my hands, fixing his bow tie with practiced tenderness, and smiled. "And you, my knight." He giggled, the sound bubbling up from a place so pure it felt like the world had been reset. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," I replied, and in that moment I meant it. The music shifted, subtle at first, then rising like the tide of something sacred. The doors opened, and I stepped forward, each footfall, steady, each breath wrapped in wonder. Kareem waited at the altar, dressed in traditional robes tailored to perfection, every line sharp yet softened by the look on his face. It was not the gaze of a billionaire or a man used to control. It was the expression of someone who had once been lost and somehow had found his way by standing still, a man who had finally stopped running from his own heart. And now he stood still, not because he had to, but because he chose to, because I was there. When I reached him, his hand met mine, not in possession, not in declaration, but in something quieter, something equal. The vows we spoke were not grand or theatrical, but true in a way that shook the ground beneath us. "I didn't find you." Kareem said, voice strong but thick with emotion. "You wrecked into my life. And thank God you did." I smiled through tears, my voice trembling but clear. "I didn't trust love," I said. "But you taught me trust isn't about being certain. It's about choosing someone even through fear." We kissed, and the courtyard erupted in applause. Am ran down the steps, launching petals into the sky with both fists, his joy loud and unfiltered. The flowers caught in the breeze, dancing above us like little fireworks, and laughter followed. Later that night, under a sky so open it felt endless, we danced, just the three of us. The desert wind carried music and memory through the air, weaving between shadows and starlight. And for the first time, nothing hurt. There was no past chasing us, no contract binding us, no silence between us. Just movement, just music, just us, just love. And a future unwritten but ours to create, with open hands and hearts that finally knew how to stay. People often say that love begins with sparks, sudden, bright, undeniable. But for us it began in silence, in rooms too quiet to be called homes, in pages of contracts signed with trembling hands and unspoken desperation. It began with fear dressed up as dignity, with survival mistaken for strength. We didn't fall into love. We uncovered it, layer by painful layer, through every guarded glance, every night of withheld truth, every small gesture that broke the rules we thought we needed to survive. Between the ink of obligation and the instinct to protect, something more honest began to grow. It didn't bloom overnight. It rooted itself in the spaces between us, between Kareem's controlled stillness and my quiet defiance, between Am's innocent laughter and the woman I was becoming. We built a family not from fairy tale dreams or perfect intentions, but from the ashes of everything we thought had broken us. It was messy, unplanned, but it was real in the deepest, most undeniable way. Kareem was never the villain in our story. He was simply a man raised to believe that power meant safety, that control was the only way to keep pain at bay. He wore silence like armor. Until one day someone dared to look past it, not with pity, but with insistence. someone who didn't try to fix him, but simply stayed. And through that, he discovered that love isn't about ownership. It's about surrender. And I stopped being the girl who sold her body for a chance to protect her son. I became the woman who realized that worth isn't something you wait to be granted, it's something you claim. And I demanded more. Not just for me, for all of us. And for once in my life, I got it. We learned together that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what came before. It means choosing not to let it define what comes next. That courage doesn't always scream its arrival. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet whisper that says, stay even when every scar in you begs to run. And the kind of love we now hold, it wasn't stumbled upon. It wasn't gifted. It was built piece by fragile piece, with hands still shaking from all they've had to let go. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a reckoning. And it's only just begun. If you had to choose between love and children, what would you choose? Do you believe that someone who hurt you can still be the one to make you happy? I used to be happy because I could keep comfort and love. If I was good enough for my family, he wouldn't leave, I said. When men get bored with the old thing, they don't fix it, they change. They find something new that knows how to listen, knows how to be silent, and most importantly, doesn't question them every night. At first, it was just a text message, then a look. Finally, a whole other person in his arms. I didn't scream. I wasn't jealous. I just took notes and remembered. Because a sane woman wouldn't ask, why did you betray me? But would answer herself, when is the best time to leave? I don't need to reduce my anger. I just need to be strong enough not to come back. And if you are reading this story and have also put your heart into the wrong person, remember, disappointment will not kill you, but forgiving yourself will save you. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story where women are no longer just waiting, their choice, and they win at the right time.